Hello, and welcome to my presentation of a unique set of documents covering the early success of Polish codebreakers during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920. That success had not only defined the codebreakers' position in the interwar Poland, but provided also the foundations for the later successes of Polish Cipher Bureau against Enigma. Uluru Rock, Easter Island Moai, Borobudur Temple, Potala Palace in Lhasa, Mostar Bridge, Great Wall of China. Some of you might wonder, what do all those beautiful places have in common with the codebreakers and the codebreaking? Most of them represent very attractive holiday destinations, but there is one more thing they share. They are all registered in the register of the World Heritage Monuments run by the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. As such, they are, or at least should be, subject to particular level of protection and recognition resulting from the World Heritage Convention. While the World Heritage Program is widely known, far less people are aware of another program run by UNESCO. Program, in my personal opinion, equally or even more important than its bigger brother, called UNESCO Memory of the World. While World Heritage Program focuses on natural or man-made material monuments, Memory of the World Register includes the monuments of the human thought, libraries, scriptures, and any other form of documents of particular importance for the history of mankind. Among them, you could find documents of so different nature as Gutenberg's Bible, musical scores by Johann Sebastian Bach, philosophical papers by Ludwig Wittgenstein, illustrated Persian manuscripts, papers by Isaac Newton, Chinese oracle bones from the Shang dynasty. Since 2017, documents of Polish signals intelligence from the period of Polish-Soviet War in 1919-1920, currently stored at the Central Military Archive of the Republic of Poland, are included in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. I would like to present you this very special archive from two perspectives, that of a historian and that of a codebreaker. I guess most of you do not know much about the historical context of events in the Eastern Europe immediately after the end of Great War. Some of you might have heard that on the same day that armistice was signed in Compiègne, Poland regained its independence after 123 years of partitions. The rebirth of the country was a difficult process. As the thrones were falling and revolutions of various flavors were raging throughout the Eastern Europe, newly reborn country had immediately to fight at least 5 different wars. Some of them were fought for the borders of the state, others for its very existence. The most difficult ordeal was definitely the never-declared war with the Bolshevik Russia. The armistice at Compiègne created a vacuum east of Poland. German troops occupying the area were being gradually evacuated to Germany, being replaced by the Soviet troops marching in from the east and Polish ones from the west. Neither armistice in Compiègne nor the peace treaty at Versailles focused on the frontiers in the Eastern Europe, so the clash of both armies approaching the point of direct contact was unavoidable. Indeed, the first clashes between Polish and Soviet troops took place in mid-February 1919, developing over time into a full-scale conflict. In the first stage of this conflict, the advantage was on the Polish side. Polish troops exploited the vulnerable position of the Red Army, fighting the White Russians in the south, to extend their control to the limits of Polish ethnical presence in the east, reaching Berezina River in Bielorussia and Kiev in Ukraine. However, soon after their victory over Denikin's forces, Soviets started moving troops to the Polish front, preparing for the offensive. When the blow fell in summer of 1920, it seemed for a moment that Poland's fate is sealed. In the beginning of August, Soviet troops were approaching the Vistula River in the very center of Polish state, fighting some 15 kilometers from Warsaw. And then came the sudden reversal of fortunes. On August 16th, Polish army had launched a counteroffensive, which routed the Soviet troops and reinforced its effect during the Battle of the Niemen River in September. Soon Polish troops were holding again the line reaching to Minsk, and the defeated Soviets were compelled to sue for peace. The military situation of Poland in August 1920 was so miserable, and the reversal of fortunes was so sudden, that the victorious battle at the Vistula River was generally named the Miracle of the Vistula. Famous picture by Wojciech Kosak includes all the elements of this national legend. You could find in it women soldiers, scouts participating in the fighting, a priest killed in one of the decisive battles of the campaign, or even Virgin Mary blessing the troops from the sky and sending the winged Polish hussars in support of the fighting army. Therefore, the discovery of the documents I'm going to cover has shaken this picture. It turned out that there was nothing supernatural in Polish victory, and that the only miracle was an accident permitting Lieutenant Kovalevsky to break Soviet ciphers in July 1919. Jan Kovalevsky was originally not a member of the cipher section. One of its officers, Lieutenant Stanisław Sroka, wished to dance at his sister's wedding and asked his colleague, Kovalevsky, for the replacement during a night watch. Kovalevsky admitted later that his only earlier contact with the ciphers and the code-breaking was a lecture of the Golden Bug novel by Alan Edgar Poe. But it proved to be sufficient. Before morning came, Kovalevsky managed to break the first Soviet message. On the very next day he was relieved from his earlier duties and transferred to the cipher section. During the next year, the strategy of the Polish army was based mostly on the broken Soviet messages delivered by his team. In the hot weeks of July and August 1920, when the Red Army was approaching Warsaw and the fate of the country seemed to be sealed, thousands of volunteers joined the ranks of Polish army, among them many students and university professors. 3 professors of mathematics of the Warsaw University, Stanisław Leśniewski, Stefan Mazurkiewicz, and Wacław Sierpiński, joined Kovalevsky code-breaking section. It is true that in 1920, mathematical attacks on codes and ciphers were still non-existent, but pure intellectual discipline of the academic mathematicians was obviously an asset in their new role. Starting from July 1920, their names appear with increasing frequency as the authors of broken Soviet messages and Soviet cipher keys. Each of the 3 professors would eventually become mathematical celebrity. Those of you who had or have current contact with mathematics might recall the famous Sierpiński gasket, alternatively called Sierpiński sieve or Sierpiński triangle, classical example of so-called self-similar sets, or an early example of fractal figures. It was Sierpiński who in early August 1920 managed to break within just few hours the new Soviet key, basing on a single intercepted message of exceptional length. This message contained Marshal Tuchaczewski's commanding the Soviet armies operational order for the decisive attack on Polish positions on the Vistula River and further progress towards Berlin. Broken Soviet message provided information of crucial importance for the planned Polish counteroffensive, crowning the efforts of Polish codebreakers during the entire war. Today we also know that the Polish advantage resulting from the successes of the codebreakers was hanging by a thread due to events in London. Polish-British relations were rather complex at that time. Edgar Vincent, 1st Viscount d'Abernon, British member of the Inter-Allied mission to Poland in July 1920, summed up his experiences from that period in a book titled The 18th Decisive Battle of the World, Warsaw 1920. In his book, he didn't include more intimate impressions, known only from his later diaries, where he was referring to the chaotic events and chaotic moods of these days. I do not know whom I hate more, the Soviets, the Poles, or Lloyd George. The British Prime Minister certainly didn't take a favorable position towards Poland. And he was not the only one in Britain to sabotage Poland's war effort. British dockers, for instance, influenced by communist propaganda, refused to load ships with war material intended for Poland. Neither of these events and opinions, however, threatened directly Polish advantage in the codebreaking. But on August 10th, and again on August 17th, the London Times published text which could only be based on the deciphered Soviet messages. Remember the dates, August 10th and August 17th. In the early August, Professor Sierpiński deciphered the crucial Tuchaczewski's order. On August 16th, Polish army launched its decisive counteroffensive. An obvious clue that the Soviet messages are being broken, published in the critical phase of the campaign, could deprive Poles of their key asset. Any change in Soviet ciphers in August 1920 could change the results of the raging battle. If we can trust any Soviet sources at all, the fact that this didn't happen, the Poles owed to Lenin himself. Soviet Foreign Minister Chicherin reportedly approached Lenin, drawing his attention to the problem of signal security and requesting higher professional standards of Soviet cipher clerks. Lenin, equally reportedly, responded that the problem was not in their professional standard, but rather their missing class consciousness, which needed to be strengthened. Soviet ciphers remained unchanged, and Poland managed to win the battle and the war. Just like many other events in the history of relations between Poland and Great Britain, these events are somewhat misrepresented in the existing British historiography. In the recent authorized history of JCHQ, John Ferris presents a view obviously distorting the truth, stating that the Soviets learned about the compromise of their ciphers through the captured White Russian officers and not as a result of a deliberate leak from JCNCS or rather one of its customers. Knowing the short time span between the original message and the Times revelations, we can easily conclude that the Soviets could not learn about the compromise of their ciphers from the captured White Russian officers. On the contrary, in the early 1920s, JCNCS, or rather the Foreign Office, its main customer in peacetime, was notorious for sacrificing the results of the codebreakers' work for short-time political goals. First deliberate leak of Soviet deciphered messages caused the Soviets to change the keys to their ciphers only, without changing the cipher construction. But another leak in and around 1927 caused the Soviets to switch entirely to the secure one-time pad cipher, which cut off the codebreakers from the contents of Soviet diplomatic and intelligence messages until 1943, until the start of Winona project. One more remark concerning the book by John Ferris. I'm afraid that described misinformation represents only one of minor problems an attentive reader could find therein. I'm afraid also that there doesn't exist something called authorized history. History represents one of those ideas that do not tolerate any quantifiers. I've been born and educated in the country, building the system of so-called socialist democracy, and I do remember that socialist democracy was not democracy at all. Similarly, authorized history could hardly be called history. Let us get back to our documents. After the victorious end of the conflict, all the files of Kovalevsky's code-breaking section were transferred to the Central Military Archive in Warsaw. This signature on one of the folders comes from this period. Nobody at that time could predict the adventurous future of this archive. It was only after the end of Polish campaign in 1939 that the German Abwehr officers captured in Warsaw a considerable part of Polish military archives. Fortunately, the newer papers of the Cipher Bureau were either destroyed or well protected, and the Enigma secret was secured. The Germans transported the captured documents to the military archive in Danzig-Oliwa. Original Polish signatures on the folders were substituted with German ones. German intelligence was not interested in the signals intelligence papers from the Polish-Soviet War, but in the captured archive there were some newer documents. German investigation allowed identification of over 100 Polish agents well placed in the structures of the Third Reich. Most of them paid with their lives for the neglect of their military handlers. Then, in March 1945, Gdańsk, or Danzig as you please, was captured by the Red Army. German archives were transported to Russia, and the labels written in Cyrillic script joined Old Polish and German signatures. We do not know why and when the Soviets decided to return the Signals Intelligence Archive to Poland. This time, the documents were stored in the archive of the Ministry of Interior. Documents witnessing Poland's victorious war with the Soviet Union did not correspond well with the thesis of eternal brotherhood between the Polish and Russian nations, prevailing in the communist period. Consequently, the documents were thoroughly hidden from the historians and the public. It was only after the collapse of communism in Poland in 1989 that the former archive of the Communist Secret Police was transferred back to the public domain, creating a well-justified shock among the historians. History of Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920 required just a thorough review and rewriting as a history of World War II after the declassification of the Enigma story. The documents were restored to their original place, Polish Central Military Archive. They were fully digitized and are now accessible on the internet under displayed address. You know already that in 2017 they were included in the UNESCO Memory of the World register. Now that we know at least the basic history of Polish-Soviet War, its codebreaking, and the turbulent history of the archive itself, let's take a look at the archive content from the codebreaker's perspective. We shall start covering the principles of construction of the most Soviet military ciphers from this period. You can see a copy of an original Soviet message as intercepted by Polish listening station. A remark in the form header indicates that it's been enciphered with key called natisk, that is pressure. Next to it, you can see the cipher key recovered by Polish codebreakers. It illustrates the basic construction principle of most ciphers. It was based on the Polybius square, extended to 10 times 10 fields. Consequently, each and every letter of the open text was substituted by a pair of numbers corresponding to the row and column number in the key matrix. This is another version of the same key. A note in the lower part indicates that the same key appeared also in variants generated by shifting the matrix by a number of positions. The form header indicates that in this particular cipher, Russian letter Y corresponds to position 09. A note in the lower part informs us that in the other key variants, the same letter Y could correspond to 06, 07, 08, and so on. This is a fragment of the same example message, rewritten for clarity, with red digits indicating corrected mistakes of Polish radio operator. In the middle part, you can see the ciphertext as appearing in the original groups of 5 digits. In the lower part, you can see the same message, but reordered into pairs of digits corresponding to the letters of the open text. Even an uninitiated eye can discover frequent appearance of group 09, which, as we know, corresponds in this variant of natisk key to the most frequent letter Y. Here you find the same message text, but with open text recorded under the ciphertext. In the message header, marked in red, we find a confirmation that the message was enciphered with natisk key. For those of you who do not understand Russian, the message represents an operational report, in Russian Oprsvodka, for midnight of 9th July. Coordinates given in the remaining part of message use a map reproducing 2 versts in an inch, and the message was transmitted from Dołginowo. So far, we were dealing with an easy part. Now comes the first complication. The note relating to the centralny key indicates that the result of just described monoalphabetic substitution is being super-enciphered using the key in form 234571, written in its natural and reverse order. Digits of the super-encipherment key are added to the result of first layer encryption using the false addition, that is, the addition with no carry. Let us illustrate the super-encipherment process of natisk key using the super-encipherment sequence borrowed from the central key. In the first lines, you can see the message open text in Russian. Underneath, the letters of an open text have been replaced with the pairs of digits according to the rule known from the natisk key. The following line, underlined, represents the super-encipherment sequence written over and over again. Finally, the last line represents the final product of the superencipherment. Even this simple superencipherment form was pretty effective. Let us take a look at the frequency table of pairs representing pure natisk encipherment. Sheer number of pairs and their statistical frequency clearly confirm that we are dealing with a monoalphabetic substitution system. The codebreakers no method of breaking this kind of cipher, at least from 9th century. Even Kovalevsky's knowledge resulting from his lecture of Golden Bug was sufficient to break it. Things get more complicated when you take a look at the frequency table of the superenciphered message. Number of possible combinations is definitely higher, and their frequency distribution more uniform, indicating that we are dealing with something more complex than the monoalphabetic substitution. But the superencipherment was not the only tool in Soviet cipher clerks' chest. Let's take a look at key вооруженный. Jan Kovalevsky made a note that instead of superenciphering its first layer, Soviet clerks were using a different trick to distort the result and mask its nature. Messages in the cipher were transmitted in the groups of 5 digits. Each pair of digits, representing a single open text letter, was separated from another one with a dummy letter or dummy number inserted into the middle of the group. Before any attempt of deciphering, the dummy digits had to be cancelled from the ciphertext. And here you can see the result of just described procedure. In the upper part of the slide, you can see the open text in Russian, and immediately below the ciphertext resulting from the substitution process with dummy digits inserted marked in red, forming the groups of 5 digits the ciphertext was being transmitted in. Let us compare the effectiveness of this simple trick with the ciphering procedures described earlier. On the left hand, we find the frequency table of the pure substitution. In the middle, the frequency table of the cipher resulting from the application of the superencipherment. Finally, on the right hand, you can see the frequency table resulting from adding the dummy digits in the middle of every cipher group. Slightly surprisingly, adding the dummy digits assures even more uniform frequency table of the ciphertext than the superencipherment, at least provided that the dummy digits were selected in a truly random way. Trick just described represented only an elementary form of inserting the dummy digits. A more elaborate system was used in the key surtuk, that is a frog code. This particular key belongs to the most advanced ciphers broken by Kovalevsky and his team. Even in its basic form, surtuk was one of the few keys extensively using the homophones. In red circles, you can see all the possible representations of the most frequent letter ye, but there was more. Key surtuk was also transmitted in groups of 5 digits, with dummy groups inserted into each and every group. Instead, however, inserting them in a constant position in each and every group, the dummy digits was inserted as the first digit of the first group, second digit of the second one, and so on until 5th position of the 5th group. But even that was not all. Before the dummy digit was discarded, it had to be arithmetically subtracted from both pairs of the groups it belonged to. Note, for instance, that digit 4 is discarded in the first group of the example in the screen, leaving 2 pairs of 92 and 26. The same digit 4 is subtracted from both pairs, producing 88 and 22. which are deciphered using the standard key matrix. Here you can see an example of the first layer of enciphering using procedure just described. After substituting the open text letters with their numeric equivalents, dummy digits, marked in red, are inserted in every group, in the proper position. In the next stage, the value of the dummy digits is added to every pair in the same group, yielding the final ciphertext. The key surtuk represented definitely the most advanced cipher used by the Soviet operators in 1919-1920. It seems, however, that even this advanced cipher was unable to protect the Red Army secrets before the determined attack by Polish codebreakers. Let us jump to some conclusions. The first one is optimistic for the Soviet cryptographers. Most procedures they were using represented the techniques widely adopted at the fronts of World War I. Applied consequently and in a disciplined way, they could assure the security of the Soviet communications, in particular considering short key validity periods and their frequent change. However, Kovalevsky and his team had a very important ally, enemy himself. Soviet cryptographers committed many errors while designing the cipher keys. Soviet cipher clerks committed equally numerous errors while using them, facilitating Polish attacks. Let us review some of their most important mistakes. This is a key to the Soviet cipher Delegat, used in the summer of 1919, right after Kovalevsky's first success with the Soviet ciphers. This extremely simple key was broken without particular difficulty, but the note at the margin, highlighted in red, indicates that a copy of the same key was captured by Polish troops and immediately delivered to Kovalevsky. Unfortunately for the Soviets, variants of the same simple key were using some of the previously described, more advanced techniques. It seems that they were described in the detail in the captured documents. They have revealed the construction principles of the Soviet ciphers. In his future attacks, Kovalevsky didn't have to work in blind. From the captured documents he knew what to look for and could concentrate on making and validating assumptions. So the first basic error committed by the Soviets was revealing to the enemy the construction principle of their entire cipher family. This happened in July 1919, in the very early stage of the war, and in the very early stage of construction of Polish code-breaking service. While this blunder didn't represent a decisive factor in the future Polish success with Soviet ciphers, it definitely played an important role speeding up the key recovery. During the next year, Polish Army headquarters were reading the Soviet messages in parallel or even before their legitimate receivers. Let's take a look at a gallery of Soviet cipher keys from the same archive. Most of them represented a pure monoalphabetic substitution, most elementary cipher known. Note that Soviet cryptographers didn't bother even inserting a number of homophones, perfectly possible with Polybius square extended to 10 × 10 matrix. It seems that most keys were designed with 2 layers of encryption in mind, but for some unknown reasons the second layer was being skipped in many cipher keys. Without the second layer of protection, either in form of a super-encipherment or in form of dummy digit insertion, Soviet messages represented merely an exercise for the beginning codebreaker, which the Poles utilized to full extent. Do you remember our longtime friend, the natisk key? We know already that it was being used in several variants, generated by the cyclic shift of the ciphering matrix. In this picture, we could see its variant where letter Y corresponds to 09, but we have learned before that in other variants of the same key, it could correspond to 06, 07, 08 and other values. Key matrices resulting from this procedure were obviously interdependent, and a simple check permitted to break the variance once the basic table was recovered. So the systematic repeatable structure of the key matrix represented heavy blunder committed by the Soviet cryptographers. In most cipher keys, the super-encipherment sequence represented the secret, along with key matrix proper. But the Soviets must have been experiencing some key distribution problems, because in some messages the super-encipherment key was given in open text, usually near the message start. In a moment, you will learn that many Soviet ciphers were reusing the super-encipherment key, which consequently were known to Polish codebreakers. In most cases, it was sufficient to take a look at the message header to recognize the super-encipherment key used. Under described circumstances, stripping the super-encipherment was a trivial task even for a beginner codebreaker. In general, Soviet cryptographers had obvious problems using the super-encipherment keys in a proper way. You might recall that the super-encipherment key was artificially extended to twice its original length by writing the number twice in its natural and the reverse order. In most networks, only half of the super-encipherment key was independent. The other half represented its mirror reflection. Not all the super-encipherment keys were using the trick with a reverse sequence. But even in those keys where this blunder was absent, another, even more serious error facilitated the job of Polish codebreakers. You see a table of super-encipherment sequences used in a number of Soviet keys. Sequence 39958952237 was reused without any modification in no less than 7 Soviet cipher keys. Another sequence was reused in 5 different keys with only minor modifications. Reusing the old super-encipherment keys greatly facilitated codebreaker's job, as he had only to confirm their reuse to be able to address the proper problem, that is, the key matrix. This slide illustrates another effect of the super-encipherment structure adopted by Soviet cryptographers. Most super-encipherment keys represented a sequence of digits of even length. Even if the Soviets decided to use a sequence of odd number of digits, their custom of using the key in its normal and reverse order resulted always in the even number of digits added or subtracted from the first encryption layer. Considering that the application of the first encipherment layer always resulted in a pair of digits, both streams were self-synchronizing. In this example, we illustrate the application of the super-encipherment sequence known from a previous slide to a sequence of repeated letter A. The self-synchronizing property of both encryption layers results in a letter A being enciphered in 6 different forms. 6. No less, no more. From the codebreaker's loose notes available in the archive, we know that this feature was heavily exploited, and with good result. It is interesting to note that the Soviet did not decide to use a super-encipherment sequence of order length, a simple solution which would cure the problem, enhancing significantly the strength of their ciphers. But even that is not all. This is an example Soviet enciphered message. Letters highlighted in red indicate the end of sentence. In fact, letters TCZK represent an abbreviation from Russian tochka, period. It is interesting to learn that Soviet cipher clerks were obviously instructed not to encipher any punctuation, including punctuation in the message in open. And this Kovalevsky's note offers an observation permitting to use open text punctuation with disastrous effect for the Soviet ciphers. Soviet cipher clerks were instructed to restart the super-encipherment at the start of every new sentence. Knowing the starting point of the sentence and knowing that the super-encipherment is restarted with every new sentence permitted Polish codebreakers to set a considerable number of enciphered sentences in depth, that is to identify fragments of messages enciphered using the same key. Setting messages in depth belongs to the most classical form of a cryptographic attack. It was developed mostly for attacking the super-enciphered codes, permitting stripping of the super-encipherment layer. If we are able to identify two ciphertexts, presumably super-enciphered with the same key, we can subtract one from the other. Remembering super-encipherment's additive character, we receive the difference of text with super-encipherment removed. Decomposing the difference of text into its components belongs to the standard techniques of classical cryptanalysis. Once we are able to decompose the difference, we get a premium. Subtracting the open text from any of the ciphertexts, we get also a super-encipherment sequence. In most cases, the application of this technique was not necessary as a result of other blunders committed by the Soviets, but it could be used as a last resort in absence of other efficient attacks. Soviet cryptographers have committed numerous and grave errors in the construction of the Soviet diplomatic and military ciphers. Soviet cipher clerks had committed equally numerous and grave errors in their use. Errors of both groups contributed to the drastic shortening of time required to break the ciphers, permitting Polish codebreakers to deliver their commanders an up-to-date and accurate operational information. Polish commanders were able to transform this knowledge into a victory. It is obvious, however, that notwithstanding any errors committed by the enemy, Jan Kovalevsky was able to improvise out of the thin air a well-functioning and very effective code-breaking service. Its role in Polish victory, even if not public, was remembered among the military leaders of the country, translating into a simple equation: effective code-breaking was equal to victory. And the role of mathematicians had played in this success caused one of Kovalevsky's successors, Maksymilian Ciężki, to reach for mathematicians' help when he confronted the Enigma challenge. I hope most of you know very well the result of his decision. I encourage you to have a look at the archive of Polish signals intelligence yourself. You might find many paths unexplored. A good example are coded Soviet messages from the period of the peace treaty negotiations. Who knows what we shall find if we pay the documents attention they certainly deserve. Thank you very much for your attention. Good luck in your quest for unbroken messages in the archive. And thank you.